The Second World War brought an end to the Great Depression and in many ways brought economic prosperity to the United States. However, after the victories in Europe and the Pacific, an era of economic uncertainty hovered over the United States. Trying to manage it all was President Harry Truman, the man thrust into the presidency following the death of Franklin Roosevelt just prior to the end of the war. With the end of wartime production, once busy factories fell silent. Labor unrest was on the rise as over 4 million workers went on strike in 1946, and inflation skyrocketed following the removal of price controls during the war. In response to this economic unrest, the Republican-controlled Congress passed the TAFT-Hartley Act, which rolled back many of the gains organized labor had enjoyed during the days of the New Deal. This short-lived economic turmoil was bad news for President Truman, who hoped to win the presidency in his own right in 1948. However, these weren't his only problems, because he also faced criticism from within his own Democratic Party. When the Democratic Convention of 1948 came along, it was unclear whether the accidental president would receive his party's nomination. From his left flank, he was challenged by former Democratic Vice President Henry A. Wallace. The liberal Wallace, along with other former Roosevelt fans, left the Democratic Party to form a new Progressive Party. Even more troubling for the Democrats was the exit of Southern delegates who opposed President Truman due to his support for civil rights for Black Americans, and most notably his issuing of Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces. The Southerners held their own convention and created a new States' Rights Party, which is better known as the Dixiecrats. They nominated segregationist governor of South Carolina Strom Thurmond as their candidate. With a split Democratic Party, victory for the Republicans and their candidate, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, seemed inevitable. Sinking in the polls and without the support of much of his party, Truman seemed destined to leave the White House. However, unwilling to go down without a fight, Truman embarked on a cross-country whistle-stop tour, giving fiery speeches and denouncing the Do-Nothing Congress. And yet, to many, it didn't seem to be enough. When election night came along, Dewey's victory seemed to be a foregone conclusion. In fact, the Chicago Tribune newspaper seemed so confident that Dewey would win the election that they printed up an early edition of the newspaper with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." And yet the prognostication proved to be wrong, as Harry Truman pulled off a stunning victory, ensuring himself 4 more years in the White House. Invigorated by his victory, Truman set out to make his mark on the country, dubbing his new set of policies the Fair Deal. The plan called for national health insurance, a higher minimum wage, investment in infrastructure, and the extension of Social Security benefits. And although Truman was unsuccessful at convincing Congress to pass much of his agenda, the late 1940s nonetheless laid the groundwork for the economic boom of the next 2 decades. The GI Bill, which was signed into law in 1944 prior to the end of World War II, provided educational opportunities for returning soldiers, as well as ensuring low-interest loans for home ownerships and small businesses, creating a path to the middle class for millions of Americans. Armed with education and opportunity, millions of Americans were on the move, ready to start careers, build homes, and start families. One area of the country that benefited from this mass migration was the Sun Belt, the area of the United States stretching from Virginia down to Florida and then west through Texas to California. This area was warm, land was cheap, and thanks to heavy investment from the federal government, jobs were plentiful. This change in population would eventually lead to a shift in political power from the industrial north to the sunny south and west. Another area of migration in the post-war years was from the cities to the suburbs. Not only did Americans have money in their pockets, but the government had policies such as the Federal Housing Administration's mortgage insurance program, which made it easier for Americans to buy homes in the suburbs. The program offered low down payments and longer mortgage terms, which made home ownership affordable for millions of Americans. Additionally, with millions of cars on the road and federal investment in highways over the next decade, it was no longer necessary to work near where you lived. Planned communities such as Levittown on Long Island offered affordable, nearly identical, high-quality homes for mortgage-hungry Americans. For men and women who had been born during the Great Depression, such prosperity must have seemed incredible. However, not all Americans were able to share equally in the post-war prosperity, particularly when it came to home ownership. Redlining is a discriminatory practice that was used by banks to deny or limit access to financial services, including mortgages and loans, to residents of certain neighborhoods based upon race or ethnicity. As a result of these discriminatory practices, many African Americans face additional hurdles toward home ownership, exasperating the wealth gap in the United States. Finally, the economy of the post-war era wasn't the only thing that was booming. So was the population. When soldiers returned home from the war, record numbers of young couples were getting married. Naturally, this increase in nuptials, along with confidence in the economy, caused a massive increase in the birth rate from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, the baby boom. This massive increase in children had a profound effect on society, including the need to invest in primary and secondary education, as well as creating a new market for manufacturers to sell their products. Utilizing new televisions that were in millions of American households, commercials advertised toys, clothes, and every other product necessary for parents to ensure that their children would live the American dream and continue to fuel America's consumer economy. Alright, so in today's video we talked about the economic and political changes in the post-war era in the United States of America. If you found this video helpful and you would like me to make more, please like and subscribe. Thanks.